Are you ready to learn how to beat the French defense? You should be. You gotta be ready for anything. And I'm not talking about chess. So, how to beat the French. We're not gonna say how to beat the French 100% of the time, because that's just a false statement. You know, you could mouse slip. You could be worse than your opponent. There's so many variables. You know, what's so funny is you look at these like opening videos, for example, on YouTube. It's like how to beat your opponent with this opening 100% of the time. Secret, rare, new opening. And then it's like, for black, go f6, controlling the center. And if your opponent controls the center, you go g5. And if your opponent does not go queen h5 checkmate, and let's say they go bishop f4, you win a piece. And that's how you win 100% of the time in chess. Bogus. Don't click those videos, even though they have like 1 million views somehow. It boggles my mind, but you know, I'm in the mood to do opening videos this week because, you know, I don't have to show my opinion, and then I think YouTube likes me better. But thank you guys for the audience retention on the last video. That was amazing. It was crazy. It was so high. I don't know why. But black goes pawn to e6. This is the French, and pawn to f4. It's called the La Bourdonnais. There is an S, but it's French. I believe it's French. It sounds pretty French to me. And maybe the S is silent, and maybe it's not. I don't know how to pronounce every word in the world. I just like chess, and amongst other things. Pawn to d5, so this is the French defense. I like to call it the better Caro. I joke with my students who play the Caro. I'm like, that's the worst French, and I call this the better Caro because I'm pretty anti-Caro, if I would say so myself. I love facing the Caro, but I don't mind facing the French either when I play this opening. So you guys know we love f-pawns. We love f-pawns in the center of the board because even though, yes, it opens up your king, if you don't get checkmated, it's very useful in the middle game with things such as rook lifts, rook shifts, rook lifts, rook shifts, right? You know, rook a3, rook g3, h3. Don't. It's good to see these types of arrows because maybe you'll find it to be useful in your games, right? a4, flank pawn, rook a3, but that's a bit off topic. That's a bit of a reach. So what line should we look at first? This is going to be like an intro video. I am actually making courses currently on more in-depth lines. Tell me what you get. Tell me which lines you want more in depth, and we will do that because I have no problem doing that because I love chess. So enough talking about that. Knight to f3. So it looks pretty peculiar, but that's better for you if you know the peculiarity than it is for your opponent who's like, what is happening? I know Nakamura played this in a tournament in 2018 and 2021, and he destroyed everybody. Like, he won every single game. It must have been like rapid, I think, but he won like literally every single game with this opening. So what moves are we going to discuss? Well, we're going to discuss the normal knight c6, queen b6 stuff like everybody that plays the French does. We're going to explain knight e7, bringing it to the center of the board, or bringing it the other way, like to h6, f5, how to deal with that. And we're going to deal with f6. So let's go less common to most common, because maybe I have faith that you guys have a good attention span. Pawn f6, not so common. Why not so common? Because not so great. Why is this opening not so common? I don't know, because it is great. So pawn to f6, what should you do? Well, it's a typical French break, but it's typically the second break in the position. And when they use it first, it's not so effective, right? Think of pawn breaks like springs in the position. If you waste a spring too early, you got no springs left, and that's not too good for you. So of course we're not going to take this pawn and give him the super center, kind of like a Blumenfeld hanging pawns in the center. That'd be very good for black. We're going to go d4, denying it, right? It's not see a pawn, take a pawn. Don't do that. Typically you see a pawn, you don't take a pawn unless it's a good pawn to take. Common sense. What now? Well, it's bad for black to take because which pawn do you take with? You take with the f pawn, and the reason being is when you castle, you're going to have the open f file, and that's going to deter black from doing some stuff that he wants to do. So it's pretty good, right? Blanket statements today. Let's say they go cd4. I think that is more realistic because then they're like, oh, white's going to have a bad pawn here. Not so fast. Queen h5, right? They couldn't punish us, but we can punish them. And now whatever they do, you're going to take on e5. And it just looks nice. It just looks like you're winning. It looks like you have a lot of threats. So I hope you convert that position. What else? Well, All right, now let's actually get into it. Pawn to d5, pawn to e5, pawn to c5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and pawn c3. You might be like, pawn, what is this? Isn't my knight supposed to go there? Well, sometimes. The fascinating thing about the French is, think of normal lines. Black, it's all about adding pressure to d4, and for white, it's all about defending d4. So the point of this pawn to c3 is to add defense onto the d4 square, but not just with the pawn. Can you think of how else this can add defense to d4? The main reason is you want to go knight a3, knight c2, and in normal lines in the French, d4 hangs on a razor's edge. In the Bourdonnais, not so much. You're always kind of just chilling. You're just big chilling because you have an extra defender that you usually don't have. Now, you might be like, okay, we want to play d4, but what if black plays d4? That's a fair statement. That is a line. Some people do play that. Now, what I will say about this line is the best thing you could do against d4 is to put your bishop on d3. Reason being is I know a lot of people don't like trading queens, and well, this would be one way to avoid the queen trade. And this bishop on d3 is very good because you're going to assume they're going to castle kingside because that's usually what they do. So d4, not such a scary move, but yes, a popular one. Now, what does black get out of going d4? Well, he gets this d5 square. So a lot of the time they like to bring this knight to e7, either bringing it to f5 or d5, typically in this position bringing it to d5. You bring your knight to a3, they're not stopping your plan, right? Because it's more of a system. Both sides are getting their setups and they go knight to d5. What is black's threat? Well, black's threat is to take this pawn here on f4. How do you defend it? Well, there are ways you tactically don't need to worry about it, but I like to go pawn to g3. I like to set up this pawn chain, and it's a very good connect 4. It does a lot of damage, and it's a very comfortable position for white to play, in my opinion. And I actually have a student who's like 1750, and he's been playing it a lot. I just taught him it, and the position, he's getting an advantage in every single position. So there's not much more you can ask for, and he plays very good players at the best club, the Marshall Chess Club, the club I grew up at, and it's very good. So pawn to h5, okay, what do you do against pawn to h5? This is what a lot of people, well, this is what GMs and IMs play against me. They want to push on the flank, but you can actually deny their flank expansion, and you own g5. This pawn could be weak later on, and your king is so safe when you're castling, right? It's kind of like the Dutch. When black pushes all his kingside pawns, and he's castled kingside, you'd think his pawns are weak. You'd think his king is weak because he's pushing too many pawns, but actually, it's the king whose pawns aren't pushed that ends up being weaker. So it's one of those exceptions to the rules, and that's what I love about chess. I love the exceptions to the rules, and this is one of those where you're able to push pawns in front of your king and still have the safer king. You could see the bar is balanced slightly in black's favor, but it's a very comfortable position for white to play. You know, bishop e4, castles, queen e2, d3, c4, knight c2. Those will be in follow-up videos, how to play this position. But you get good stuff, and black, again, does not know what's going on. All right, what else? What else? Let's say they do not push the pawn. What else could they do? They can go knight g e7, queen b6. These are all commonalities. Let's say knight g e7 does not stop the fact that we want to play knight a3. Quick note. If your opponents ever play c4, it's a horrible move. Why is it a horrible move? Because it's an overextension. They're not gaining a tempo, right? These are the types of pawn chains you only want to play when the bishop gets trapped and you win a bishop, right? Even if it was a tempo gainer for black, it's still a bad move because of how committal it is. Things to note, you're always happy with these doubled pawns if that ever arises because it gives you the open B file and they're very hard pawns to capture, right? It's like when black goes knight h6 in the French and you take it and you're like, oh my goodness, I doubled their pawns, the open G file, and then they crush you because that's a French motif. Same thing when they put a knight on a6 and you take it, these doubled pawns are typically bad, and getting the bishop in return for the knight and getting the open file is more than favorable and more than justifies the doubled pawns. So back to why c4 is a mistake. c4 is a mistake because you go b3 challenging the integrity of the pawn structure. Now, okay, first of all, they never have b5 because of takes. If they played this and b3 and then b5, you have a4 if the knight was not yet on a3. That'll be a further line in other videos, but you know, takes, you take with the pawn, you get the file. This is just good stuff, right? You know those Slav positions, Queen's Gambit, all those types of positions? The open A file is a blessing. It is typically a blessing. So they should not go c4. So what should they do? Well, let's say they go knight to f5. What would you play here? The way my mind works is when I see a knight on f5 before I played the move knight c2 d4, I like to go bishop to d3, adding pressure to the knight. You don't want to snap it off right away, so continue with your rotation. The reason you don't want to snap it off right away is it's not budging, right? It's staying there. It's not an outposted knight, but it's not budging. So leave it there, and the more time you leave for your opponent, the more time you leave for him to make a mistake, such as the move c4, which now gains a tempo, but you get the trade you wanted in a favorable manner because his structure is poor. So let's say he played good chess, and let's say he castles. Now you could take the knight because maybe he knows his stuff and he's not capitalizing or not making the mistake, and then you play d4. So this is kind of the setup. Imagine g3, you get this nice house, and you might be like, wow, that's a bad dark squared bishop. I actually disagree. This bishop comes to life in the late middle game, early end game, and it sometimes ends up being actually the best piece on the board. Now, let's say they take. Typically, you take with the c knight, and this trade always helps you, and queen b6. Now, against queen b6, it's very tempting to go bishop e3, but this is not such a poisonous pawn because we have not yet castled. So I like to play the move queen e2, which guards the b2 pawn. Okay, yes, it guards the g2 pawn, but that's not the pawn we wanted to guard. And this allows you to play bishop e3. They essentially need to put this bishop on e6 at some point to guard everything. Now, you don't want to take it because that fixes their structure and you lose this beautiful knight. Now, I like to go bishop to e3, and the reason I like to do that is it sets up a little trick, a little tactic, where if black is not careful, there's this discovery where even if the queen wasn't here guarding the bishop, it backwards guards the bishop, and it's just a winning position. You win a clean pawn, and your position springs forward, and sometimes more than that. Castle, you just start blowing open with f5. So what they should do is go bishop to c5. This is very common, and then what I love about this position is I love to play the move pawn to b4. In these types of positions where either they move back and you have the tactic, or takes, you get the bishop backwards guarding the pawn, which guards this. So it's kind of like a little bit of a unit. If this bishop ever moves from e6, there's clearance sacrifices later on when you're blowing open their king. And I believe the dark squared bishop is better than the light squared bishop. And then you could castle, you could go king f2, it's really flexible. You could push the h pawn, you could coordinate on g4. There's a lot of good stuff here, and there's actually like a Kasparov Nigel Short position that's kind of, I think it stemmed from a board in A, and it was like this where Nigel Short defeated Kasparov because Kasparov was so cramped up. There were knights on the position, granted, but it was similar to something of the sort. Now, what else could we look at? Let's say they don't go knight f5. Let's say they don't go knight f5. Let's say they go queen b6. Just to show you that it is more systems based, you're going to go knight a3 here. Again, why is c4 a bad move? Pawn to b3. It's even better here. So let's say knight a3. Let's say they go knight h6. Still knight c2. And if they are delaying going knight f5, then you can indeed go d4. Takes, knight c takes, and then let's say they play something like bishop c5. Bishop c5 is typically met with pawn to b4 is the best move. Bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes, pawn takes. This is the best they're going to get. And in this endgame, you might be like, hey, aren't their pieces better? I would argue long term you have the bishop pair, and the king is so flexible. Like, it can literally go anywhere. You connect, remember these rook c5 lines when they claim the c file. And yeah, I would say give the board in A a try. Let me know how it goes. There's no real tricks you can fall into. This was an intro video to it. I can post more about the board in A. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you as always for watching. Have a great day. Peace.